How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the video. My name is Nate, and today's video is going to be about trendline basics. All right, let's get into it. So what are trend lines? Trend lines are going to be used to draw support and resistance levels on a chart. Now, trend lines can be either horizontal, like so, or they can be diagonal. Now, how can we use support and resistance trend lines? Well, we can use them to help identify trade entries and exits or trade setups on a chart. So let's get into it. Let me show you a couple of examples here. I'm going to go over 2 pivot trend lines, 3 pivot trend lines, 4 and more pivot trend lines. Now, believe it or not, it does make a difference whether it's a 2, 3, or 4 pivot trend line. There are rules that we have to follow, and they do vary depending on how many pivots the trend line is hitting. So here in this example, we have a 2 pivot trend line. And what I'm going to do is take the trend line and extend it all the way across. Now, with a 2 pivot trend line, you want to make sure that you are using the absolute low of the pivot. And as you can see, I'm doing that, and I'm going to extend this all the way out. Now, what's cool about this is we now have a clear level of support, and we can use that to help us find a potential future trade setup. So what I mean by that is at some point in the future, price could potentially come down and retest this trend line. And when it does, we could potentially see a bounce. And what you could do is enter a long position here and obviously exit at some point, making a profit, hopefully. So that is a way that we can take a trend line and use it to help identify a trade setup. So that is a 2 pivot trend line. Remember, you want to use the absolute lows of the pivot. Now let's take a look at a 3 pivot trend line. It's essentially the same thing as a 2. You're going to take the trend line, drag it all the way across. Now, the only difference between a 2 and a 3 pivot trend line is, remember, in a 2 pivot trend line, you want to use the absolute lows of the pivot. Now, with a 3 pivot trend line, you can use either the candle wick lows or the candle body lows. Whatever you choose, you want to be consistent with it. Okay, so let's take a look at a 4 pivot trend line. Now, this is where things get a little bit different, just because when you have a 4 pivot trend line or more, very rarely are they ever perfect. So sometimes you might have a wick that pierces, or price might just barely be above the trend line. But I'm going to show you in an example here. So we have this pivot here, right? So I'm going to draw a trend line from the low of this pivot and extend it all the way across. So let's do this just like that. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, make it a little bit easier to see, and check this out. So we have a gap here, and there's even a little gap here. So this is what I mean by 4 pivot trend lines, 4 or more pivot trend lines. They're not always perfect. So what you can do, because when you have a lot of hits like this, you want to include as many of the pivots as possible to make the trend line as accurate as possible. So that's what I just did here. So I dragged it up. So now you can see price is hitting this pivot here, this pivot, and this one as well. So we now have another support trend line, and that as well can be used to help us determine, potential future price action, maybe entries or exits. But kind of like in this situation, what I would use this trend line for actually is to kind of as an indicator of whether price is in a bullish trend or a bearish. So whereas in to the example I gave a minute ago, I said, hey, you could enter long here, right? Well, in this one, I would say if price broke below this trend line, that would be very bearish. However, as long as price stays above this trend line, it is bullish. So that's just kind of another example of how we can use trend lines to help us identify whether we're in a bullish or a bearish trend. All right, so in the last example here, we've gone over 2, 3, and 4 pivot trend lines. So this is kind of cool. In this example, I'm actually going to show you how we can use it to identify a trade setup. I'm in replay mode just to make it a little bit easier to see. So let's do this. I'm gonna take this trend line and connect these pivots right here, just like that. So that's going to give us our resistance trend line. Now what we're going to do is we're going to try and find a support trend line. So look, we have this little pivot right here. I'm going to drag it all the way across and connect that. So now we have our support trend line. Does anybody see anything interesting about this chart? Well, what we have here is we have a bullish consolidation pattern. And what I mean by that is we had this move up, right? And then we had price consolidate in this wedge pattern for an extended period of time. And what that does, think of it like this. If you have a marathon runner who runs a marathon, they can't just go and run a marathon the next day, right? They need time in between to rest and prepare for the next marathon. It's the same thing with price. So when price makes a big old move up like this, typically it's going to need time to recover before making the next move up. So let's exit replay mode and see what happened. Check this out. Look at that. We had a nice breakout. And what you could have done here was you actually could have entered a long position on this breakout candle. And if you had done so, look at that. I mean, that is a huge move. That's a 30% move. I don't even, like, usually I would sell after like 15% or something. But either way, this is an example of how we can use support and resistance to help us identify not only a pattern, but when that pattern breaks out and an entry. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you found it useful, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos. Thank you.